One of the things that came out in the defamation trial between Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, this came out in his testimony, is the fact that he says that he stayed with her despite so much abuse, psychological abuse, and even physical abuse. He claims that he stayed with her because he had a deep sense of empathy for her. He loved her, but also he said that he had always had this feeling that he could fix people, that he shouldn't walk away, that he should hang in there with it, and that if he just tried hard enough, if he just loved her hard enough, then he would be able to fix it. And of course, as a number of you know who were following the trial, Johnny got into a discussion of his relationship with his mother. His mother, whom he had said on many occasions was very abusive. In fact, he said that he suffered physical pain every day of his childhood and his adolescence when he lived with his mother because she was so abusive. And yet, he tried to be very, very empathetic toward her. His response toward her was one of empathy, and he says that he feels like he transferred that sense of empathy into his toxic marriage with Amber Heard. Now, of course, a lot of you know that Amber Heard in the trial, she basically claimed the reverse of that. She said that she was the one who had put up with the monster, as she called it, and Johnny Depp's jealousy and his temper tantrums and his abuse. And she said that she stayed with him because she felt like if she stuck around, if she hung in there, then she could fix him. And of course, we know based on the trial verdict, we know who the jury believed. And statistically, we know who most people believe, right? But this is not a video about so much about Johnny Depp and Amber Heard as it is about the topic of empathy. And, we tend to think of empathy as a 100% all the time good thing, right? That it is just, empathy is just always qualitatively good, and it can never be bad, it can never be damaging, it can never be problematic, right? Is there a way in which, though, we can have too much empathy? Is there such a thing as an excess of empathy? This was the thing that Johnny Depp and so many people who've been in abusive relationships say, is that they want to leave, they see that the other person is abusive, they hate the abuse, they know it's toxic, and yet there is this feeling that, well, if I just empathize more, if I just show that I care more, if I just can really get through to them, I know there's a good person in there. I know that she's a good person. She's just trapped, She's just trapped in these abusive cycles. She's trapped by what she grew up with. Well, I think that, there's a lot that we can dissect in that. But I think that one of the things that's interesting to think about is the fact that there are actually healthy limits on empathy, and that too much empathy, and empathy in particular that is misdirected, can be an unhealthy thing, can be a bad thing. And there was a psychologist who published a book in 2016. The psychologist's name is Paul Bloom. And he published a book in 2016 entitled Against Empathy. And you would think, well, gosh, that sounds like a crazy book. Who would argue against empathy, that we shouldn't have so much empathy? Isn't empathy something that we need more of in our world? Well, yes and no. And the conclusion that Bloom came to was a very interesting one. He said that, yes, oftentimes empathy can be a great thing, that it allows us to see the other person's perspective, it builds bridges between us, it helps us it motivates us to help other people when they're going through hard times, to help our fellow human beings, that sort of thing. But empathy is a kind of a tool that also can be used in a negative way, and it can be exploited. And there are a lot of people who misdirect their empathy onto objects or onto people who are not only toxic to them, but also abusive or even destructive. And one of the things that Paul Bloom got into in this book is also the fact that because empathy is an emotion, that empathy does often have the potential to cloud our better judgment, to cloud our rational thinking. How many of us have gotten into unhealthy relationships or stayed in unhealthy relationships, or how many of us have gotten into some kind of trouble or difficulties with relationships in our lives because we didn't listen to our rational brain, which was telling us there's something wrong with this person. or this person is abusive, or look at these red flags, right? Or if you help this person, you know they're just going to turn around and blow your money on something that you didn't want them to blow it on, right? All these different scenarios, right? We go through this oftentimes every time we're at the stoplight and there's someone who's panhandling for money. I know that I go over this scenario in my mind. It's like, okay, I feel really bad for them. I empathize with them. I could see myself being there, you know, if I were in those circumstances. And yet the rational brain kicks in and it says, okay, but what is most likely going to happen if you give this person money? Well, I always give them money anyway, because my thinking is whether they spend it on food or whether they spend it on drugs or whatever I can do to help this person have an easier day. Sometimes I just feel right about that, right? But what Paul Bloom would say is that empathy gets a lot of people into a lot of trouble because empathy can have the effect of turning off the rational brain. And sometimes, or oftentimes, the rational brain might be the healthier brain to listen to than the empathetic brain, because empathy can be misdirected and empathy can cloud our judgment and it can cause us to overlook red flags or to continue in toxic relationships, right? And so when I look at the Johnny Depp Amber Heard situation, and I think about this idea of someone who just keeps hanging in there with someone who is perpetually abusive toward them, cuts their finger off, you know, all of that stuff that we heard about in the trial that went on between Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, and you can even hear it on the recordings. You know, if any of you, I know a bunch of you have listened to these recordings that were played in the trial of conversations between the two of them, and you can hear Johnny Depp pleading with Amber. He says, please, there can be no more violence. There can't be violence. If there's violence, we have to separate. I just need to get away from you. I need you to let me get away sometimes. I can't handle it when you're being violent and aggressive with me. And there's this pleading in his voice, right? To which she responds, you know, with this, no, there's nothing wrong with fighting. There's nothing wrong with fighting. You just want to run away. You just want to be a coward. You just want to run away. And you think to yourself, how can he continue to show so much empathy in the face of that toxic, aggressive abusiveness that she's displaying? And what a psychologist like Paul Bloom would say is that we would do well in life not to turn off our empathy, but to see empathy as a kind of a neutral tool that can be engaged for good, but also for the negative. And that if your empathy is overriding your rational brain, or if your empathy is putting you in unsafe or toxic situations, or keeping you in unsafe or toxic situations, then maybe you don't need to listen to your empathy, right? Maybe you need to turn the empathy down. Feelings are not reality necessarily, right? And when we mistake feelings for reality, then we can get into trouble. Now, this is very much a counterintuitive argument because, again, most people would think that you can't have too much empathy or you can't have misdirected empathy. But that's not the case. You know, there was a TV show that came out, I think it was on the Paramount Channel this past year. It was called 1883. And it was really good until it got to the end, and then it kind of went off the rails in the last few episodes. But for the first like 2/3 of it, it was really good, and it's about pioneers, and it followed this pioneer family as they try to get through this trek across the American frontier. And of course, you know that the lives of pioneers were very dangerous on these treks that they would make. And 1883 shows that there's a lot of death and there's a lot of risk and disease and everything. Well, anyway, in one of the episodes, this pioneer family has been camped out with some other families, and these other families are not as shrewd, not as smart as the main pioneer family. They don't know, for instance, that you're supposed to boil water from the river before you drink it because you don't want to get diseases. You don't want to get, cholera or whatever, right? And so what happens is the less shrewd, the less astute pioneer families, they don't boil the water, they drink it, and they get cholera or dysentery or whatever it is, right? But their stomachs are messed up, and some of them are going to die. And what happens in this episode is that the main pioneer family, the smart pioneer family, the ones who boiled their water and are not having these issues, the daughter of this family, she comes to her father, played by Tim McGraw, and she says, and because he's telling her, okay, it's time for us to leave. We've got to continue our trek. And she says, Dad, how can we leave? Look at our friends here. They are very, very sick. They need us to stay here and nurse them through this and take care of them. And it's a really poignant moment in the series, because her father looks at her, and he looks at her with all of this understanding and compassion and insight, because he looks at her and he realizes, I have this beautiful, empathetic daughter, and bless her heart, she cares about these people. She wants to stay behind. She wants to take care of them. But you know what he does? He doesn't say a word to acknowledge what she's saying to him. He just looks at her. He gives her a serious look, and he says, it's time for us to go. And, the thing about this world is that it is a difficult world, and it is full of suffering, and it is full of pain. And we look at the pain that other people are in, even if they're causing their own pain, even if it's like Amber Heard, who keeps getting herself into trouble because she's hurting other people, and she's being a narcissistic, toxic person. But we look at people in pain, or we even look at people who cause pain, and we empathize with them. We understand that they are the way they are because of circumstances beyond their control, because of how they were raised, or their brain chemistry, or because of whatever. But I think that one of the things that's helpful to remember is that we did not create this world, and we did not create the suffering in this world. Unless you're God, which you're probably not, you are as much a victim of circumstance as anyone. We are all inmates in this crazy prison called Earth, planet Earth, right? With all the good and the bad that entails. But I think that it is helpful when we feel overcome with empathy for toxic people, to recognize that it is not our job to save these people. We did not create them. We did not create their problems. And it is not always the wrong thing in life to cut someone loose to save yourself from their toxicity. You think about the example of people on a plane, when a plane is going down and they tell the parents to secure your oxygen mask first before your child. Well, of course, if you have a child, you have an obligation to that child. But if you're flying through life with a toxic person, you need to make sure that your oxygen mask is on, and that you've got yourself straight, and you've got yourself safe and everything before you start worrying about them. And too often, too many people, especially in toxic relationships, or just relationships with difficult people, they're trying so hard to get the oxygen mask on that person, and that person is just fighting them every step of the way. Well, they're both going to end up going down. Put the mask on yourself, take care of yourself, and that might mean separating. And what I'm saying is that there are appropriate times in life to look at people in pain and to feel that empathy, but then to do like Tim McGraw does in 1883 when he looks at his daughter and he says, we've got to go. And sometimes in life, when you were in a toxic relationship, or when you were shackled to someone in a situation where it's you or them, or where you need to look out for yourself and your mental health, or your physical health, or your self-interest, I'm telling you, there are times in life when it is okay to look at that situation and look at that person and say, it's time for me to go. And thank God that Johnny Depp, in that situation with Amber, that he finally got to the point where he saw, sorry, babe, it's time for me to go. All right, if you like this little snippet of philosophy and pop culture, check out my YouTube channel. I've got a lot more where this came from. And if you enjoyed this, I always appreciate a tip. Links are below, and you don't need an account. You just need a credit card. All right, bye, everybody.